مرحبا جميعا وأهلا وسهلا فيكم بهيدي
Hello, good day. I'd like to welcome you in this webinar. First, I'd like to say that the interpretation into English is available, so you can follow us and listen to the interpretation in English or in Arabic. This webinar is a series of webinars organized by the Arab NGO Network for Development (ANND) in parallel with the 27th Conference of the Parties COP27 in Egypt. Today, we will discuss the major outcomes of COP27 negotiations on resilience and adaptation. It's very important to focus on these key points within the climate challenges that we are facing and that are directly linked to climate change, including, for example, natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and other disasters in different countries, especially in the developing countries and developing countries. Also, there are the repercussions for the climate change at the living level. It affects the food security, health, environment, infrastructure, water, and nature in general. Our main goal from this webinar, of course, with the experts who have joined us today through Zoom, is to discuss the following issues: the impact of climate on food security, the repercussions of the climate change in the countries of the South, and of course, the resilience and adaptation and losses and damages. I would like to welcome first Mrs. Sarine Karajerjian, the Program Director of the Environmental Politics Program at the Arab Reform Initiative. Sarine has worked for 15 years in Islam Paris Institute for Public Relations at AUB. And she has worked on different issues such as the strategies, building partnerships, and managing grants. Sarina was working on her PhD in anthropology, and she has a master's in the environmental planning and BA in health environment from AUB. And also we have through Zoom, Mr. Schechla is the coordinator at the Housing and Land Rights Network at the Habitat International Coalition. He is also a specialist in the international human rights and in developing and providing the trainings for NGOs and international governmental institutions and agencies on human rights and development, focusing in particular on implementing the international humanitarian law and the economic and cultural rights, as well as documentation and advocacy and other issues in the MENA region. And of course, Mr. Schekla's work focused on housing and land rights. We will organize this webinar as following. First, we will raise the questions on the speakers and we will ask them to share their interventions and their answers in 15 minutes maximum. And after that, we'll open the floor for discussions to ask their questions and to provide their interventions. So we'll try as much as possible to focus on time so that later on we will open the floor for discussion. First, we'd like to start with Ms. Sarine. Despite of the discussions and the most recent developments on the issue of loss and damages, and it's being dealt with in a direct way, we want to see if there will be huge pledges or even real pledges and commitments from the developed countries, and if they will fulfill these promises or pledges. I know it's early maybe to know if COP27 will be capable of reaching this huge change on the long term. However, when it comes to the losses and damages, what was happening at the level of the current discussion that's happening in Egypt, especially when it comes to the solutions on the affected countries and developing countries affected by the climate change? Thank you, Diam. Thank you for ANND for hosting us and for organizing a series of webinars. Allow us to speak in English because there are technical terms that will be better to express ourselves in English.
If you think of the COP27, I mean, this is not a new COP in the region and for the region. But unlike the previous COPs, there are certain expectations specifically coming from the global southern activists that you cannot disassociate social justice, human rights from climate justice. This is one of the main outcomes of this COP. The second one is about loss and damage. I mean, what does loss and damage mean? If we look at Pakistan and if we look at Africa as a global continent, they have, Africa itself and Pakistan produces or less than 1% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Yet when it comes to the impact of climate change, it will be affected the most in respect to other countries. And who will be responsible for the reparations? We've discussed about multiple pledges in the previous conference of parties. These are, $100 million have been pledged at the conference of parties in Copenhagen, and that we should be receiving them by 2020. We are a year of 2022. We still haven't seen these pledges being properly formulated. So if we are going to think of the conference of parties, we look at three things. One, yes, it is an international convention, an international summit that brings a lot of visibility specifically to the global south, but yet who are the ones monitoring and responsible of the fossil fuel crisis? Let us not forget that historically it's the industrialized countries that have had their own revolution and their industrial revolution, unlike the rest of the region or specifically from the global south. There are several aspects now being discussed that the conference of parties in Sharm el-Sheikh is a failure. One, it is heavily dependent on fossil fuel producers and emitters. Large corporations are there physically on the ground. They have booths, they are present, they are very vocal, they have access actually to the negotiation table, unlike other activists from the global south who have not been properly, being heard. This is one. Two, we're seeing, Coca-Cola was the main sponsor of the COP27. At the moment, it is also very debatable, knowing that Egypt wants to be the global, responsible or the global actor when it comes to single-use plastic and banning plastic use in its country. So if we look at these different positions of the countries from the global south, specifically going back to our region, our Arab region, Egypt wants to position itself as a climate negotiator, but yet facilitating finances. And these are the main two topics that were raised. Loss and damage was, again, for the second time, raised on the national or on the agenda of the COP last Sunday. It was discussed by global leaders, but yet many activists from the global south have skepticism as how are these financial mechanisms, who will be facilitating these financial mechanisms, how will it go to governments of the region, knowing that the history of corruption of these governments and authoritarian regimes in the country, in the region. So these are the questions that are being actually asked and put forward as a result of the COP. The second thing is related to different commitments. We are in a region, where there was a side event, led by the 22 Arab countries, but led by Saudi Arabia, that there will be pledges and, more than, just to give, pledging $2.5 billion to the Middle Eastern Green Initiative that seeks to reduce regional carbon emissions by 60% in the coming years. How serious are we with these pledges? Again, who will be the ones who will be responsible, knowing that now globally we're moving again to this whole debate of raising fossil fuels. And even today it was mentioned around the COP that fossil fuel companies and corporations and private companies are the ones controlling, monitoring, and setting up the agenda of the Conference of Parties. This is not new to international and global climate negotiations and climate diplomacy, but yet the expectations are a bit more skeptic, if we can say, from the global south. So again, the question here is who will monitor these financial commitments? How will we receive these financials or even climatic, not just commitments, but these pledges that we have been promised for many, many years, and yet at the moment from the global south, we have not been receiving it. We are talking now about a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. Some are expecting that if this continues as is, we might go to 5% increase, which will be enormous and will affect vulnerable populations, and specifically from the MENA countries. So again, I mean, these are some of the points that I wanted to raise, but just to maybe, you know, and then we can open up for discussion. But both, you know, Arab and African countries, they have placed high hopes on the COP27 as an opportunity to make a case for renewed assistance in dealing with climate change as a way to confront the looming environmental threats. It remains to be seen how this will unfold during the conference negotiations, as African and Arab countries remain consumed by competing interests, while rich oil and gas producing countries seek the prestige of being called leaders in sustainable development. They have so far remained reliant on fossil fuels and plan on maintaining production as per the global market's demand, casting doubts on their commitments to the Paris Agreement that pushes countries from the global north to, and also from the global south, to have, you know, national determined commitments that are supposed to, by the year, let's say Lebanon, to give an example, by 2030, we have committed to reduce by 30% our energy consumption. Though look at where we are in the country that is completely going through a crisis. How can we even go back to these numbers? And specifically that we are not the ones, you know, contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions. Our focus should be more on adaptation projects, on projects that can tell us how can we solve our current crisis, how can we have more energy, how can we even have more energy when the country is completely in a collapse phase, where we are now pushing more for renewable energy, knowing that renewable energy might not be the solution. As we have seen, there were studies also there that were made towards that solar is not enough. It is trendy at the moment to go solar. Everyone wants to do it, but what happens with the cost? Who will be monitoring the waste from the batteries, etc.? So again, we can open up for more discussion in the later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarine. هلا بدي اتوجه للسيد جوزيف شكلة.
I would like to give the floor to Mr. Joseph
حكت
Schechla.
شوي عن loss and damages
Sarine has talked about loss and
والإشكالية
damages to a certain
هلا
extent
موجودة
and
أمامنا،
talk about
ولكن
the dilemma
أنا
that
حابة
we're
شوي
facing.
على موضوع
However, I want to
loss
focus
and
a little bit
damages.
on loss and
نحكي
damages
على
and to talk in
الوضع
particular on
المرتبط بحقوق الإنسان. يعني هلا عم
related to
نشوف يمكن
human
طريقة
rights.
تعامل مصر مع
We're
الناشطين
seeing
البيئيين
maybe how
غير
Egypt
مشجعة،
is
لأنه
dealing
بتشير
with
إلى
the
رفض، إذا
environmental
صح التعبير،
activists,
التعامل مع
not encouraging
الأشخاص والنشطاء يلي
because
بيحملوا مطالب
it's
الأشخاص الأكثر
somehow
تضرراً من الأزمة
dealing with
المناخية.
the people or
وبالتالي
the
سؤالي
activists
لحضرتك،
whom they
كيف يمكن لنا ضمان تخصيص عادل ومباشر للموارد بإطار العدالة البيئية وطبعاً
how can we
حفاظاً
guarantee
على
environmental
حقوق الإنسان؟
justice and respecting the human rights at the same time?
Sorry, you're on mute.
Can you hear us? You're on mute, sir.
So I'm one of those. شكرا ديام للمقدمة الكريمة، وشكرا لسارين لتمهيد الطريق لهذه الأسئلة المهمة. I will speak in English and I will share my screen if that's okay, but I need to be enabled to do that. First of all, I personally come from the global north, but I'm transplanted happily in the global south, where in fact I share much of the skepticism that Sarine spoke about. In fact, we have a great gap between the norms and the practices that we know are necessary and what is actually being done. So what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the lessons that we've learned about loss and damage, and to do that as a function of climate justice, which is also a goal besides just saving the planet from physical destruction. We have already a normative framework for at least one. We have others, but a normative framework for climate justice is one that is provided by the Mary Robinson Foundation, dedicated to climate justice. It includes, of course, and this is adapted from their approach, their methodology, and respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights is at the top, including, of course, the right to development, which is not to be forgotten when we're talking about resilience. Resilience is fine when we're speaking of infrastructure and construction, to be resilient to face various environmental challenges. But when we talk about people, resilience is fine, but that is not sufficient to put the onus of resilience and recovery on the victim, the affected population, nor is it sufficient to return to the same dismal condition that was before. So recovering to that unfavorable position is not sufficient, but sustainable development remains a goal. Of course, sharing benefits equitably, ensuring that decisions involve participation, gender equality, and equity, both harnessing the transformational power of education, and using effective partnerships to secure climate justice. Another framework comes from our organization, Habitat International Coalition, and from a statement last year by our president, Adriana Allen, that focuses on very much the same things, but more as an outcome that there should be profound economic redistribution, a recognition of differences and invisibilities that, of course, involves convergence and non-discrimination, gender parity and political participation. We also speak about democratic control of climate finance, and human rights as a human rights habitat without war, and mutual care, solidarity, and social responsibility. So benefiting from this normative framework, we can track where we are in this process. We have, of course, spent a lot of time and words on the diagnostics of what's been going on, what is coming in the future, and measures to prevent those dire consequences by adaptation and mitigation. But we also have the remedial measures, which are at least as important. Much of the focus is on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But when we talk about loss and damage, historically, loss and damage has been a state-to-state concept and issue. But what we're focusing on is the human-centered reparations that is also based in an international normative framework that is made up of human rights treaty obligations, human rights related to development commitments, obligations under treaty, commitments that are non-binding under the 2030 agenda, for example, but also ensuring accountability and the victims' rights to remedy and reparations. So in other words, looking beyond that state-to-state compensation that is on the agenda right now. That brings us to the loss and damage associated with impacts of climate change, which was promised already in the Paris Agreement. Article 8 established that the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage associated with climate change would be maintained in the agenda going forward. We have, of course, in that a set of main focuses of that mechanism, looking at, of course, slow onset events beyond just the dramatic events like we saw in Pakistan, but also on non-economic losses. And what this means is those values that are not normally traded in the market. It could include cultural identity, cultural endowment, many of the values that are intangible in many ways. Of course, a comprehensive risk management approach is absolutely necessary. And one of the main consequences of climate change that affect us and concern us directly as a housing and land rights network is the human mobility or the displacement that arises from that. Now, of all of these, there is the fifth focus of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and that's on finance, action, and support, otherwise known as FUS. But that is the weakest of all the accomplishments of the Warsaw International Mechanism to date. So over the last 9 years, there's been some lack of balance. Also, there are three key functions of that mechanism: enhancing knowledge and understanding of comprehensive risk management approaches. That's certainly progressed. Strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies among relevant stakeholders. To some extent, with the exclusion of many affected people, that dialogue, of course, continues. But in the area, the third area of enhancing action and support to address loss and damage, that again is lagging far behind in the functions of the mechanism so far. What we are looking at, of course, for about the same chronology as the existence of the mechanism since 2000, a little bit before 2009, Habitat International Coalition has operated a housing and land rights violation database. And this is typically focusing on forced evictions and displacement, destruction and demolition, confiscation and dispossession, and the violations that arise from privatization. Also, a key issue in the global climate finance that is going on, especially in our region. We can talk about that at greater length later. But we have also added to this violations of this kind that arise from climate change or in the context of environmental hazards. Now, what we've had to do in order to identify these kinds of displacement and damage as violations is to develop a methodology based on the human rights and international law framework that identifies the state as the principal duty bearer when it comes to remedy and reparations, but there are other liable parties involved. And out of that process, we've explored about 100 cases in the database. 36 of them we reported in our latest report on World Habitat Day last month in pursuit of climate justice. And out of these arise a set of contexts and factors. So in order to classify and better understand and organize the causes, consequences, and possible remedies, we've come up with these contexts. So conflict situations, of course, very prominent in our region, cross-border effects, especially pollution of various kinds, development-induced displacement, which is common across the world, environmental racism and discrimination. We certainly know that well in this region, but also in the rest of the world. Extractivism as a context, mining, exploration for minerals and petroleum, etc. Failures in governance, also common to many, industrial pollution and contamination, large-scale agriculture and livestock farming, mega projects, neglect of a kind different from the negligence in governance, but neglecting entire populations. For example, the internally displaced in Sudan and the floods that they've just incurred this year. Tourism, urbanization, which is a hazard, and other human factors, including individual liability. Now, just a word about that normative framework. We have a definition of forced eviction by the Commission on Human Rights, 2 resolutions that identify forced eviction as a gross violation of human rights. In particular, sorry, this is not coming through right, but and also a definition from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that forced eviction includes the involuntary removal from a home or land without the sufficient legal and other protections. Now, a gross violation, according to international law and the General Assembly, general principles of international law, call for reparation and remedy for victims. This is found in a resolution of 2006, and we're following that framework to understand what are the values at stake and that need to be subject of reparation. First of all, it's not led by compensation. The first entitlement of reparation is restitution, and that may often involve return, which is, of course, a human right for centuries, resettlement in the case of displacement, rehabilitation in all of its aspects, social, physical, health, economic rehabilitation, and then compensation for those values lost that cannot be subject to restitution. So we need to be clear that reparation is something much more comprehensive than just compensation. And it's not just about money. It's also about guarantees, institutional guarantees of non-repetition of the gross violation and the satisfaction of victims. That's often the missing link. And then we add to that, where there's cross-border displacement, the international law principle, the peremptory norm of non-refoulement or non-return of refugees seeking asylum. So how do we seek the satisfaction of victims? And what we've done is to develop already in 2009 a violation impact assessment tool that allows us to have a certain approach of understanding, where we have in this graphic in the center of the circle a human right related to habitat, and then that links to the violation, which in turn delivers impacts, negative impacts on affected persons and victims. And following clockwise, we that impact calls for redress, and that redress and the remedy or reparations as a deterrent for continuing violation should, of course, inhibit further violations. And again, I'm referring to reparations, redress as reparations defined in international law, and those 7 elements that I just identified are at the left of your screen. So when we consider the composite of values at stake, of course, we have the land, we have the food, water, energy nexus, whether you follow that model or this model, it's only a slice of the values at stake. What we're talking about here in our more comprehensive approach to loss, costs, and damages is a nexus among water, land, energy, food, housing, livelihood, and well-being, whether that's physical well-being, emotional well-being, and of course, the enjoyment of culture is linked to that as well. So we need to have yet a broader scope. What we've sought in this, using this tool, is versatility, not just assessing out of context, but we can apply this to a baseline, as a baseline survey, an inventory of assets under threat, We can use this tool as an assessment of losses as a result of an eviction notice, that, for example, or at the time of the violation, the time of the dispossession or the displacement, and in the longer term, after that human mobility, involuntary human mobility has taken place, then we, more specifically, we've applied it to transit camps or temporary intermediate shelter, settlements, resettlement sites, cases where there's no resettlement on offer, and even when there is a compensation, to compare the values lost, the costs and the damages to what's offered in compensation has in some cases revealed how insufficient those policies of compensation for damages are. Now, applying it in various scales, we've applied this violation impact assessment tool, for example, to the case of Topsia, a village in the region of Calcutta, but also upscaled it to apply to the issue of land restitution and what's necessary to achieve transitional justice in Yemen, when transitional justice, of course, can take place. So it can be upscaled or used at a very local level. This is just a chart, dizzying though it may be. It's just an example of the 30 cases that we've applied it to, local, various contexts, and of course, even at the national level, as in the case of Yemen. And out of this experience, what we have been able to develop is a methodology that calls for and actually delivers human-centered norms. Those already exist in the law. We don't need additional norms, but also a human-centered practice that puts the focus on the people. And this also gets to the question that Sarine mentioned, this state-to-state compensation has left us very skeptical, not only because of corrupt governments, but also by clear experience, whether it's from the Holocaust industry, compensations offered, the intermediaries that intervene before the victims or in the place of the victims. And we need to develop both these human-centered normative approaches and also a practice of loss and damage that is focused on people and their full reparations. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Joseph. I want to see if any of the participants who have joined us want to raise any question or want to write it in the chat box or in the Q&A. For those who want to ask any question, a direct question, you need to raise your hand and write it in the Q&A question or answer, or use the technique of raising hands.
While waiting for the participants to ask their questions, I would like to thank Sarine for defining the general framework of this topic. Thank you, Joseph, as well, to linking that to what Sarine said, to the right to development, to human rights in general. Since we're talking about practical steps, Sarine talked about adaptation projects, about the importance of adaptation, of having practically projects to adapt. And she talked about the nexus between human rights, basic human rights, and between climate justice in general. My question to you is the following. What about civil society organizations? What can CSOs do as communities, as activists, as experts, as CSOs? What role can we play? How can we be part of this path, of this track, of these projects, practical adaptation projects? What role can we play? So my question is to Sarine and to Joseph alike. So I don't know who would like to answer. Yes, I can try to answer that. In ARI, the Arab Reform Initiative, we had organized a webinar 2 weeks ago approximately, and we've been working with the activists from Arab countries on this topic. We always rely on the West to draw our data and information. And in the Arab countries, mainly in the global South, we don't have enough data, enough knowledge, enough information from Arab countries and from South countries in general. So we should be able to lobby our governments, of course, but we should as well promote partnerships and coalitions between activists in different countries of the South so that we can all work together. The aim is to share information, share data, share knowledge, to learn from each other's experiences, mainly in terms of advocacy, of lobbying, be partners and cooperate with whom exactly so that we can amplify our voices. Our work does not stop at COPs in general, whether this year, COP27, or after that. It's not only about our work in the framework of the COPs. We should work on loss and damages. And I would like to shed light here on a paper that we had published last week about amplifying the voices of activists. Where can we hear activists? How can we hear activists? Putting a story to our everyday struggle. People in our countries need dignity. We need to convey our voices. We do not have enough spaces to convey our voices, to communicate, to talk to each other. We're waiting for COPs to be able to communicate. We have plenty to do on a daily basis, practically on the ground. I think knowledge sharing, knowledge production is extremely important, mainly in our countries in the South. We should have ownership over our data rather than import data from abroad. Coalitions, very important, regarding loss and damages in particular. Here, I would like to tell you about Ryan Qasim, who is the head of the Youth for Climate Network, and he always says that loss and damages are given to states, but why don't we work directly on loss and damages with the civil society? Why don't we have projects to support the civil society, not only support the states? So the civil society should play a major role in that in order to be able to fund loss and damages, have a directly addressed loss and damage funding to them, to CSOs, regarding knowledge production, knowledge sharing inside Arab countries. This is very important. What Joseph said is very important, an initiative tool that is more than great. We have a follow-up question to the question that you had asked. What is the role of civil society organizations and NGOs in Sharm el-Sheikh summit now in the COP27? As far as we know, very few CSOs are taking part in the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, but I don't know if you have something to answer. We have two other questions in the Q&A box from Amal. You can read them in the Q&A. How optimistic are you, Joseph and Sarine, regarding the implementation of what will come out of this COP? And is there a platform already in place to follow up on these issues, or should such a platform or entity be formed? Amal asked another question. What do you think about some activists and what they are doing? So how they're acting regarding the attacks on paintings, on art, throwing materials on paintings. I can answer. Thank you. I would like to thank you, Amal, for this treasure of questions. Yes, all these questions are linked to one another, and these are linked to what Sarine was saying earlier. In what sense? We truly need solidarity, cohesion, coalitions. We need empowerment to share experiences in order to be able to face the huge challenges, not only climate change related, but to be able to finance the green transition. And in order to be able to collect data, gather data and statistics about our situation, about those who are victims of these losses and damages. We cannot rely on a third party. We need to learn our lessons. And this lesson is clear to many communities, many societies, mainly those who are the most vulnerable. We need to develop our capacities, our methodologies, our approaches to be able to gather data on the values at stake, the costs. We need to identify the losses and damages. We should trust ourselves rather than rely on third parties, especially if we're talking about parties that are interested in redress, whether we're talking about countries from the north or from the south. So we will always face obstacles, of course. It wouldn't be easy, but we need to find ways to overcome these obstacles. We need to go back to the values at stake, to our values in our countries. Regarding the civil society organizations and the COP27, there are many entities, many organizations that are present. I am close to these organizations, but I'm not present in person there. We are following up closely on the role on the role the CSOs are playing, but we truly need a more critical thinking or more critical analysis, mainly in terms of financing, funding, loss and damage, and green transition. There are many challenges, yes. Last year, I'll give you an example. We conducted a study with ANND on financing the green transition. And we have discovered how unclear things are. From all the data that was gathered on different websites, platforms, we still cannot know the exact figures, the debts, and the budgets. To which extent is funding allocated, for example, to the private sector? We have discovered that in cases such as Morocco and Egypt, 40% of the financing is going directly to the private sector to privatize energy and water sectors. This is a true risk. Other risks can be noticed whenever we have a host country for the COP that went into a deal with Shell a $2 billion deal to be able to extract fossil fuels underwater. And this would eventually affect communities on the ground. We know how experiences are in South America, and how much communities there are voicing their concerns over the projects being implemented. But on the other hand, there are many good practices to fight climate changes, while there are many contradictions at the level of the states. So states are pretending or sometimes combating climate change, while at the other hand, investing in projects that are harming the environment. Thank you, Joseph. We still have one question in the Q&A, and Yusuf will have another question. So we have the question of Azzeddin, our colleague. He is talking about climate change that can increase forced displacement of people, mainly in Africa. In fact, he is talking about forced displacement because of drought, because of floods in Africa, which have increased even more than the forced displacement caused by cases of violence and conflicts. So how can we face the repercussions of the climate crisis and their impact on the future of development in Africa? So I tried to summarize what Azzeddin was asking. We can link that to migration as well. We are in Africa, so that we don't forget we are in the African continent. It is estimated that because of climate change in Africa, almost 86 million will be forced to leave their houses, will be forcefully displaced by 2050. So 86 million persons will have no home, will be forced to move out of their regions, out of their homes, because of climate change. This is a true challenge. This shows that Africa, more than any other continent, needs assistance. So this is an estimation of the number of people that will be forced to leave their houses. So the majority of those who will be forced to leave their houses will belong to the African continent. So out of the 200 million, 86 will be from Africa. So we need to rely on the assistance of others. To build on what Joseph was saying, there are many studies that consider that 700 million will be forced to leave their houses. We will have around 700 million displaced forcefully by 2030. Some figures show that.
If there are no specific projects and financial support to the African continent. يعني هلا حاليا اللي عم ينحكى على الموضوع just like to give some figures ما زال ما عم نحكي. At the moment, only 5.5% of the global finance pledges have been allocated to Africa, whereas it needs are estimated between 1.3 to 1.6 trillion US dollars from 2020 to 2030. So what is 5.5 globally when this is the largest continent that will be affected by the climate change, and estimating more than 700 millions will be displaced?
If we go back to the civil society, and we were talking about that earlier, of course, there are coalitions that are happening practically on the ground, and these coalitions are not new. There are NGOs, CSOs, human rights NGOs that are being more and more active on the ground. They're coordinating with others because this is a momentum. We can seize that opportunity to coordinate or to communicate. Nevertheless, to which extent can we have an impact in the conferences of parties? That would be difficult because we have corporate participation, and this is why I'm talking about knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, and advocacy from the region, in the region, so that all activists from the region be able to communicate together and serve that objective. And this is what should happen as think tanks, as academics, as universities. We need to raise our voices, to work together and to amplify our voices, mainly in these shared spaces. And even Diam is saying outside these international conferences held once per year or every 2 years, we can work in parallel. We have a comment or a question from Yusuf, who had his hand. Yep. I don't know if I have questions to Sarine or Joseph. In my PhD thesis a year ago, I had talked about climate change and the International Court of Justice. I was talking back then about how we should be able to raise issues related to climate changes and file suits related to climate changes before court, whether the local or international courts. Would that do good to developing countries or not? We know, for example, that there was the special tribunal for Lebanon, and this STL is an example of my question. I heard, for example, that there was a law in Belgium, if I'm not mistaken, that allowed for climate crimes to be presented before courts. So can we hope that one day will be, we will hear about climate criminals?
Joseph, you're on mute.
Sorry. I could say something about that. There are at least 3 major efforts afoot now. There is the very interesting case of the Portuguese children who are taking 33 European states to court. They are suing in the European Court of Justice, Court of Human Rights, for the climate change imposed and its consequences imposed by those states in their region. We have also a move within the General Assembly to call for an advisory opinion on climate change. We don't have a resolution yet, but it's being certainly lively, there's lively discussion about that. Another proposal is a formal definition and a text to be amended to the Rome Statute that would recognize ecocide as a crime against humanity. That would be, of course, that would require the agreement of at least 2/3 of the parties to that statute, to that treaty. What's very interesting about that is that this rather official proposal that came from an international panel of experts to the to the parties, to the Conference of Parties, is not new. It came forward actually in 1970. A professor named Arthur Garston from Yale University, plant botanist, who identified as a crime the practices of the US Army using Agent Orange in Vietnam, but they've also used Agent Orange in the forests of Oregon as well in the United States. It was also proposed by Olof Palme, the well-known and highly respected Prime Minister of Sweden, at the Stockholm Conference, the first UN conference on the human environment. So we're talking about now at least 52 years that this concept is being discussed at the level of science and at the level of international law. And it only reminds us of how long it takes for these norms to be adopted, let alone to be implemented. But I would say to Yusuf, this is a really important development. And in all these cases that we have, there is great hope amid the skepticism that this kind of a legal normative standard setting development could lead to some form of climate justice, particularly in the South, but not only in the South. It's not a matter of geography because, of course, certain areas are being affected more than others, but this kind of destruction, wanton, perverse destruction of the environment has been taking place in every region.
شكرا. تفضلي سليم.
On this note, I mean, also going back, I mean, look at the Ukraine war at the moment. We see so many maps that are being shared, or where are the bombs, you know, hitting, and we don't see such maps coming from the region. Syria, Yemen, Libya. We don't have, you know, coverage of the implications of a war and even the cost of militarization on the local countries or the countries from our region. Why is so? I think this is a question that I'd like to ask also. I mean, this is something that we're also now looking at, you know, if you want to monitor an oil spill that happened because of, it was targeted by a foreign country. Also looking in Iraq, for example, in the south, in Basra, at the moment, you know, the whole, you can't even talk to an activist from the south of Iraq because of, you know, the fear element that is present and the multiple, you know, pressure that activists are receiving from let's say an example is Iraq because of the fear element, but at the same time the data is not there. They want to even, you know, go back to sanctions and so on. So, but also the loss of hope when it comes to international UN and other resolutions vis-a-vis our region. I mean, this whole region is going through multitude of crises and wars and occupation, but yet nothing is being, you know, pushed for or even towards our interests. Again, these are different. So how much hope do we have in these international negotiations, in these international humanitarian organizations? Yet we do have to engage with them because, I mean, if we can't live without them, but yet we have to be very critical towards their presence, ICRC, UN, and others that have been historically present to actually, you know, promote human rights and violations. And asking the questions about climate finance as well, you know, these pledges might be coming in the form of loans, where already many of our countries have debts. So who will pay for these? Loans that might take for years and years for countries like Lebanon, Syria, and others to even pay them back to the international UN bodies, etc., etc. So let's not forget also the issue of loans, rather than these are not grants that we are given, these are loans that are given, and they have to be paid back to the countries who are supporting these adaptation projects in the region. So putting us more in depth. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but it's the truth.
You are right, Sarine. These suggestions, these pledges, if I could say so, if they are implemented, will place a huge burden on the shoulders of the most affected countries by climate change and the most vulnerable countries. We have two questions in the Q&A. Taher, about recycling. What are the possible solutions to promote the conventions related to recycling? How can we reactivate these instruments? Another question from Isam to Joseph. How can CSOs or NGOs in our Arab countries measure pollution in the absence of good governance, and while the information is unclear, there is no official or non-official, formal or informal information? And are there mechanisms to overcome these obstacles?
Emphasize what Sarine said. It's absolutely true. As I said also, we don't know quite what the public debt is going to be for some of this finance, but looking just beyond the climate change displacements, which are slow onset, certainly in the Nile Delta. This is a future hazard. In 2018, we did a kind of a survey of the displaced persons eligible for reparations after displacement from war and conflict in our region. Then we discovered that there are at least 33 million people whose situations remain temporary, unremedied, and that was in 2018. That number, of course, would be more now because of Syria, because of the dynamic situation in Libya, and certainly in Sudan, where displacements are continuing to grow. So you will not find this figure in any UN source. And I think that this is also indicative of the need for us to have a regional approach to this problem. It is one of the contexts in which human mobility, forced eviction, displacement on a grand scale is taking place, and those people are suffering until today, and some of them for decades. Now, how do we measure? Well, the question is, how can we measure the damage and the losses, and how do we remedy them if we don't have? This is a main obstacle for us, that we don't have in, for example, the COP, in the Warsaw International Mechanism, or in any other global policy mechanism or platform, a methodology for quantifying these losses and what, in fact, people need to have in order to recover. Not that the onus be put on them to be resilient, but that, in fact, reparations be made to them. Not just money, but so many other things, including institutional reform, policy reform, and criminalization of forced evictions. So many things are needed, not just in our region, but everywhere. Now, we have used our own method for measuring losses, and it is versatile. We can adapt it in many ways, and so we're actually proposing that this type of community-based data collection be a priority, so that there is a human-centered approach to loss and damage and its remedy. If I left anything out, please tell me.
Thank you, Joseph. Sarine, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I don't know if we still, if we can answer Tahir's question about recycling. So what are the possible solutions to re-examine, to review the different instruments related to recycling? I don't know if Tahir would like as well to raise his hand and speak directly to both speakers or not, but if you have an answer. Hello, I'm Tahir Ben Yassin from Tunisia. There are some conventions, some instruments, and some bilateral agreements that are signed. For example, in Tunisia, there is an agreement aimed at recycling. It was a recycling initiative, and this is an agreement with Italy that was signed with Italy, if I'm not mistaken. Based on that agreement, there are some types of waste that should be recycled, but there was a problem after that regarding to that recycling project. Some started talking about the impact of that recycling on civil society on community organizations. So can we, or is there a way to review these conventions, these treaties, these agreements, whether in conference related to climate change or not? So can similar agreements, similar instruments be reviewed or not? Thank you, Tahir. A year ago, we conducted a study about the decentralization of solid waste in Tunisia. Yes, you are right. There are some international agreements and conventions that have been signed regarding the treatment of solid waste, for example. But as you can see, we have here a corporate capture. It is the private sector that is controlling these projects. So private companies present in Europe, for example, and France, would come and implement projects in Tunisia, and we have seen similar examples in the absence of any consultations with the communities at stake, with the local communities living in the area, in Sfax and many other regions to the southern part of Tunisia have been affected by similar projects, and no one talks about that, and no one tries to find solutions to that. There are international instruments, international agreements and conventions, yes, and international frameworks, but who is benefiting from these frameworks? Who is implementing these frameworks, and who is making who accountable, if I could say so? There might be international instruments, but this doesn't mean that they are binding. There might be sanctions, but these sanctions are not forced onto specific countries. And this is very important to mention regarding the solid waste management and solid waste projects in general. Thank you, Sarine, for this clarification. I don't know if Joseph has anything else to add. I would like to tell you about a coalition we are part of, the International Coalition for Extraterritorial Human Rights Obligations. Studies have been conducted about these specific cases. Case studies were examined regarding recycling projects and how some of these projects have been implemented in countries of the south while importing the waste from countries of the north. So we have a coalition regarding the extraterritorial obligations of different states and about the receiving state that should abide by international instruments. However, there are many countries with weak governments that do not have the capacity to refuse or to reject similar projects. As a society, as experts in international law, we've been working on developing the criteria and on raising these issues and on filing suits about these issues before relevant courts to prevent similar examples in the future. Thank you, Joseph. Since we only have 5 minutes left, I don't know if any of you would like to ask any question. I don't know if you have final messages, recommendations, key messages that you would like to share. Sarine, Joseph, I don't know if you have anything else to add. You have 1 minute each. As we were saying, knowledge production is extremely important for us to have a local agenda, an agenda from the region for the region. Coalitions are extremely important between civil society organizations in this region. Researchers as well should play a major role in conducting as well their studies. In 1987, there was the Montreal Protocol, and we stopped talking about that. From that date, we need to spare no efforts. We need ongoing efforts so that if we truly want to succeed, build coalitions, cooperate together, because unfortunately, we don't have hope in current governments. This is why we need to work together. Civil societies are doing a great job, but they need to build more coalitions. We need to work more together. We need not only to think about how to share our knowledge during similar summits, but have a South cooperation, a South agenda for us to be able to raise our voices. we have discovered through time how much victims and those who have incurred damages and losses feel that they are living in silos. This is why they should network more, so promote networking. And I'm talking here mainly about those who are under occupation. People of Palestine, Sahrawi people from Tibet, from Kashmir need to get acquainted with one another more and more. They need to promote networking between one another, because the oppressors work together, share their strategies, share means of oppression, tools, instruments. They have all the resources they need. But the victims, on the other hand, should join forces, start working together, and find ways and mechanisms to cooperate. In parallel, the civil society is facing huge challenges. Climate finance, for example. This is a new topic, if you could say so, a new theme, and we need resources for that, skills for that, the right expertise for that. We need to be able to face these challenges together. We need green financing, yes, but we need experts for that. Control, monitoring, evaluation of the climate finance, of the loss and damage financing. This is a new topic of experience. So the civil society needs to develop its methodologies, approaches, skills. We need to work together in order to have enough experience in these new themes, if I could say so, so that we can break our silos. We have allies, we have partners across the world, in Europe, in the US. We have partners and allies that have experience in this field, but in our region, we need to work more together to develop our experience in monitoring, control, and in facing all the challenges. Thank you, Joseph. We still have 2 minutes, and I guess there's a participant that would like to ask a question. Please be very brief, Isa. Hello, I haven't seen you for the past 10 years, Joseph. I'm happy to see you, and I'm happy that you haven't changed a bit. I had asked a question regarding the COP. Based on the list of participants, I noticed that there are very few CSOs taking part in this conference, and they have very few resources and capacities. So I think that now we're confronting the governments, countries such as Lebanon, for example, suffer from the absence of the state. There are CSOs working on the environmental topic. That's good, but these rely on funding, on financing, but funding can stop at any time. They have very limited resources and they weren't able to develop themselves. When I started working in the Middle East, and when I measure what these institutions are doing, I find that that situation is not that good. Regarding case studies, there are many researchers, many experts that communicate with us. There is data, but governments are marginalizing information. In Syria, we were able to gather data from the government, but the data was not accurate. So there are no clear mechanisms that can help collect data. There is a problem with data collection, data gathering, we should have a revolution. We should be present in any conference, in all conferences. Remember, in the World Social Forum, when it was held, there were parallel events that were organized. So we need more campaigns on the margins of every conference held. This might lead to arrests, to harm sometimes. But we need to do it anyway. We don't only need case studies, we need practical actions. We can cover what you will be doing on the margins of the conferences, on the margins of these summits. Thank you, Aysam. We value your opinion. I don't know if Joseph has anything to add. You are right, Aysam. So we don't have much time left. I would like to thank you, Sarine and Joseph. Thank you for your input. Thank you for the discussions. Thank you for the input of all the participants. I would like to remind the participants, if you would like, you can register for tomorrow's webinar, which will be discussing the main outputs related to gender, youth, future generations, and we have another webinar on Friday. You can find these in the chat box, the links for you to register. And Sarine posted her email address, so I copied it and pasted it for everyone to be able to access it. Thank you, Sarine. Thank you, Joseph. I would like to thank all the participants.